Welcome to episode 327 of the Postal Hub podcast. I'm Ian Kerr. Joining me in a moment are Mike Plunkett, President at PostCom, and Mark Fallon, President of the Berkshire Company. We're going to talk about another eventful year for the US Postal Service. Joining me on the line are Mark Fallon and Mike Plunkett. Mark is the CEO and President of the Berkshire Company, and Mike is President and CEO at PostCom. Welcome to both of you. We're going to have a chat about the US Postal Service, the postal scene in general in the USA, and maybe at the end, the Postal Service, the band. I don't know. We'll see how we go. There are people right now saying there's a band called the Postal Service. There's one in every country, everybody. They have a local name. They're on tour at the moment, says Mike. Well, there you go. Let's start with the Board of Governors. The US Postal Service Board of Governors, I understand it currently has a couple of unfilled vacancies. What's the deal?
So the Board of Governors are nominated by the President and then affirmed by the Senate. And the President really is given an entire year to replace a governor. However, two governors, the holdover year expired on December 8th. So we have gone down from 9 to 7. And another governor, his term just expired on December 8th. So he's in his holdover year. So we could be 1 year from now down to 6 governors.
Just doesn't seem as though those appointments have been a priority for the administration. If you want some possible good news, yesterday there was a breakthrough and hundreds of military nominees that had been held up just cleared the Senate. So maybe we'll see some movement on those two positions, which, as Mark indicated, just gone vacant.
And I think it has a lot to do with the political priorities. I mean, there are 2 wars going on that are impacting the country. There's a very tense relationship with Congress and the president right now, just trying to get the government funded. Never mind. So in the scheme of major issues affecting, I would say, the headlines, the Postal Service is below the fold, as we would call it back when newspapers were printed.
And I'd say there's a little bit of complacency. Last year, Congress passed what they considered to be a postal reform bill. And there's sort of a sense that mission accomplished, and there's really not much need to pay attention to postal issues right now, which is somewhat unfortunate, I'd say.
What does that mean for the day-to-day operations of the Post? I mean, is there anything that can't be done because there's not a full set of governors, or is it just doesn't have any real impact on, say, what the PMG does or what his direct reports are doing?
Well, the current board has really not checked the Postmaster General at all. They've gone along completely with the rate increases. They've gone on completely with the Delivering for America plan. So day to day right now, there isn't an impact. If they get below, is it 5, Mike? If they get below 5 governors, we will be back where we were under the Obama administration, where they will have to create a temporary exigent committee in order to handle postal rate increases and other appointments.
What I'd say about that, though, is it historically, it's been pretty common for the governors to more or less go along with postal management. I don't find that unusual. And, there's no immediate concern. But as Mark indicates, if you get below a certain number, then you do lose some capacity to act as an appropriate check on postal management.
And let's say you're an Australian podcast host with an interest in the postal sector. How do you go about nominating yourself for the US Board of Governors, US Postal Service Board of Governors?
Believe it or not, there was a portal when the Biden administration took over, and I self-nominated. There is a vetting process, and you can self-nominate. Generally, though, it helps to be affiliated tightly with one of the political parties. As a registered independent, I offer no value to either side.
Let's talk about some more day-to-day things when it comes to the operations of the Postal Service. What's the story with headcount? Because it's something that a lot of posts are grappling with at the moment. They're trying to maintain or control their costs, and posts are often one of the biggest employers in the country. So has there been any sort of headlines there in the US regarding the headcount at the US Postal Service?
I'd say there will be pretty soon. You're starting to see a little bit of pushback as the Postal Service has started to look at consolidating some facilities in the face of declining volume. And they're already starting to receive messages and letters from legislators who are concerned that there might be reductions in some of their areas of the country. But you haven't seen it really come to a head yet.
And in fact, 2023, there were 5,000 more employees than 2022. However, that also had to do with the Postal Service relying less on temporary employees and moving people to full-time employees. But as Mike said, this consolidation will do some reductions. The numbers I've seen are fairly small when compared to the 640,000 employees. It's not like 64,000. It's not 10%. It's about 5% is what they'd be looking at.
What about the pricing then? Because that's the other side of the coin often when you're talking about the financial state of a postal operator, the pricing. What's the current state of affairs with regards to price increases? And I was reading somewhere about the PRC, the Postal Regulatory Commission, which has oversight or responsibility for oversight for things like letter pricing, having some sort of a vision for the future when it comes to letter pricing. What's going on there?
I'd stop short of calling it a vision, but recently the regulator did indicate when they approved the most recent rate increase for mail that they are going to accelerate their planned review of the regulations governing postal rate increases. 3 years ago, the Postal Regulatory Commission pierced the price cap and allowed much greater pricing authority to the post. And that was subject to a 5-year review that wouldn't have happened until 2025. But it sounds like they're going to speed that up and probably start that early next year.
Well, I think that as Mike said, there is no vision. What's been interesting is that although the Postal Regulatory Commission gave the Postal Service almost too much authority, which has been proven, that even just their minor pushbacks has created, I would call it a tense relationship between postal management and the Postal Regulatory Commission. And that, I think, is one of the things that is leading up to this, hey, we need to look at this sooner rather than later.
It's a strange situation. The Postal Service has one of the strongest monopolies of any post in the world, and yet they operate almost without regulation. The U.S. is the only place that I'm aware of where the Post increases rates on its monopoly products twice a year, well above the rate of inflation. And so it's not surprising the PRC would finally get around to pushing back against that. But they've enabled and created the most punitive rate regime of any post in the world.
Now, the question that always gets asked is, what impact does price increases or do price increases have on letter volumes? Have there been any studies done in the US in relation to that? I know there have been in other countries that there have been studies done into it, and that has generally shown that e-substitution is happening at lower price points. It continues to happen at the higher price point, and we haven't seen an acceleration in declines in letter volumes. What's the US experience?
You could argue last year was the worst year for mail in the history of the Postal Service. The only other times volume dropped as much as last year were in response to the COVID pandemic in 2019 to 2020 and the Great Recession from 2007 to 2008. There were no major external shocks last year. In fact, the U.S. economy outperformed expectations, yet volume fell by unprecedented levels. And it's hard not to conclude that that's a direct result of price increases. Our association is working with some economists to study that right now as we speak.
And while I'm not an economist, I am working with a lot of companies, and they are actively planning to further decrease their volumes of mail. And it's not just diversion to electronic, Ian. In some cases, it's just they're not going to use additional communication to their customers. So in other words, it's the marketing side, not first class mail. So here in the States, first class mail are your invoices, your bank statements, etc. That decline wasn't as bad last year as the marketing mail. And I think that channel is decreasing rapidly. And it's not just due to cost. It's not just due to e-presentment. It's really due to this outrageous cost increase.
Recently, Citibank in the U.S. made news by informing their customers that they would not have access to online banking services if they continued to insist on receiving a paper post-billing statement. I think they relented in response to consumer reaction, but that's what large commercial mailers are looking at right now, ways to accelerate their ability to get out of that channel.
I was talking, Mike, and I'm putting you on the spot. Sorry, Ian, I don't know if I'm allowed to ask a question, but I was asked the question at a major print mail service provider in Chicago yesterday, what I thought the mail volumes would decline in 2024. And even though it's an election year, which usually generates political mail and generates more advertising mail, I think marketing mail, even with that push, will go down another 8% in 2024.
A little bit of a timing issue there. The election mail bump that almost certainly will happen is late in the calendar year and will affect the 2025 postal fiscal year. So they're not going to get much of a bump from election mail in this reporting.
Well, I'm going a little bit off script here, everybody, but we've just seen Denmark announce that it's abolishing the USO altogether. That's after years of going to, first of all, alternate day delivery and then delivering standard letters one day a week. There are a number of levers that posts can pull when it comes to responding to falling revenue in letters and rising costs because you've got more delivery points. The US population, I imagine, is increasing. So therefore, the US Postal Service has to deliver to more residential addresses. So it's not just about raising the price. There are other options available, whether it's alternate day delivery, reducing the number of delivery days, looking at alternative delivery models, moving away from employees to subcontractors perhaps. Now, I'm just throwing a few ideas out there. Has there been any discussion in the US about any serious discussion about finding other ways to drive efficiencies in letter delivery other than purely pulling the pricing lever?
Well, I listened to that discussion with the gentleman from Denmark. And one of the things is that many European posts have a very well-defined USO, while the Postal Service does not. But what did happen in that Postal Reform Act of 2022 is they did state in law that letters will be delivered 6 days a week. So it went the opposite direction of what you just described that other posts are doing. Instead of saying potentially 3 days or 4 days or 5 days, they said, no, in law, you will deliver 6 days a week.
Now, that's correct. And that's the law I referred to a little while ago. Now, there is some ambiguity in there. It does say that the Postal Service will maintain a 6-day integrated network. It doesn't, however, make it explicit that you have to go to every single house 6 days a week. But I'm not aware of any effort by the Postal Service to look at serious alternatives to the current model, which is driving past every single residential delivery point in the United States 6 days a week.
Well, there are ways and means, but I think that if we went into that, the ways and means, we'd have a very long podcast, everybody. An interesting topic, but perhaps one, I don't know, maybe we will go into it in a bit more depth another day. Moving onwards then, I think we may have already answered this question, but my question was going to be, just recently we've seen more losses from the US Postal Service. I thought in my naivety that this legislative reform that went through was going to help the US Postal Service achieve, if not profitability, then at least reduce the losses. What's happening?
Well, when you raise rates twice a year, you lose volume, and you lose volume on your most profitable product.
And we're back to headcount, Ian. we'd mentioned already how much volume declined last year, but at the same time, overall postal employment went up. And volume is down more than 40% since the 2006 high. And yet postal employment as a whole has been relatively flat. Now, yes, delivery points grow at a rate of about 1% a year. But I believe it's fair to say that some of the cost savings anticipated when the Postal Service put its 10-year plan in place have not materialized. And the volume losses that Mark's described result in a situation where price increases are not yielding revenue increases in the way they would have been expected to. And that combination is dire. And we're looking at big losses in 2024 as well.
Now, another thing that I read about was this project called Optimize. I have to look at my notes now. Optimized collection. What is optimized collection? Because it didn't seem to have been greeted with universal acclaim, shall we say. What's it all about, really?
So what it's about is part of the 10-year plan is to consolidate delivery units. So right now there are, I think, 19,000 delivery units, which are smaller post offices. So the carriers pick up their mail at these small post offices and deliver them. They're being consolidated into sorting and processing centers, and the carriers will drive 20, 30 miles to pick up those, which means now that local post office doesn't have carriers coming every day. And under the optimized collection plan, at least is what we've been able to glean, because it hasn't been made fully public to the mailing community, is that now when mail is brought to the post office in the morning to fill the post office boxes that people rent, that's when they will pick up the previous day's mail and retail packages. So if the carriers are delivering the mail at 8 o'clock in the morning, if you post a letter at 9 a.m., it will not actually go into the postal system until the next day.
Well, the upshot of that, of course, is that for customers who use those post offices, they will experience an additional day that it will take their letter or package to get to its destination, something that I don't think many people are aware of yet.
So if I've understood this correctly, there'll be a single mail drop-off and collection at these post offices. So instead of having a mail drop-off in the morning and the mail collection in the afternoon, it'll be combined drop-off and collection in one stop, shall we say? Yeah?
Correct.
That's
Correct.
right.
And the impact and reasoning behind it and a schedule for it was never published. Fortunately, a really good blogger at Save the Post Office was able to get hold of information from one of the unions because they had to let them know about it. And I really need to compliment Mike. Mike has led an effort and gave interrogatories to the postal regulator, who has now passed those along almost verbatim from what Mike wrote to the US Postal Service, asking, you need to define what this is and how are you going to measure performance?
I can't claim credit for that. Those questions which the regulator posed were clearly prepared before they saw anything from me. But we were curious about, what this is about and what the intended results are going to be. And it's good that the regulator has stepped up to try to get greater transparency. But so far, I'd say you have to look at the Postal Service's responses as a form of stonewalling at this point.
Are we talking about remote post offices, by the way? Because as an Australian, I can imagine, I know of situations where a post office is at the end of the line, where the delivery van has dropped off at other post offices. It gets to around midday. He's traveled a couple of 100 kilometers or something. And he waits in that town, has lunch, and then picks up the mail in the early afternoon and starts his long route back to the sorting centre or wherever he's based. So it's not, beyond the realms of possibility in my, limited imagination. Are we talking about remote post offices in the US context?
Not that remote. So this isn't the post office at the bottom of the Grand Canyon where there is one. These are
they use donkeys, by the way. So
or mules. I think they use mules.
Right. And they're unionized mules as well, everybody. So look out.
Well, they're Teamsters who drive them. But these are not that remote, but they are smaller post offices around larger cities. So from what we can see, because the first place where this went into effect is in Richmond, Virginia, which is, you have to go many hours away from Richmond to be considered remote. And the post offices that are being impacted are within 30 miles of Richmond. So it's not that remote.
I feel like I should point out this might be a very sensible initiative. And it may be that given how little volume is coming from these offices, this is a sound business decision. I think the concern that people have is that it hasn't been communicated effectively. And if it is a national change in the terms of service, that does require an advisory opinion from the regulator, which hasn't been sought. So we have some questions, but in no way are we dead set against this. We just want to understand better what the goal is and what it's intended to achieve. And it may be that this is something that is necessary.
So I have to respectfully disagree with my good friend here. I think it's a very poor business decision. The Postal Service has never capitalized upon the use of the retail offices, that amazing footprint that they have. And they're now saying, you know what, don't bother coming because we're going to add a day. They just released the new first class, the package, small package product that had a reasonably good launch. If you are now saying that that new package product is going to take a day longer, right? You're going to take a day longer. Why wouldn't I go to one of the other carriers who will pick it up that afternoon and get it into their system? So it's truly, I think, a misunderstanding. I don't think the Postal Service has ever truly understand the jewel that they have in the retail offices. And by declining service at them, it's adding another nail in the coffin.
Now, we could talk about post offices if we want to. It wasn't on our schedule, everybody. But the ability of the US Postal Service to leverage its post office network, it's something that I've heard a couple of people in the US say quietly previously. Let's say it out loud now. It's a very broad network. It's probably the biggest retail network in the US, is it? Is there anybody who comes close? It's probably more than there are McDonald's or something like that. Am I right?
By a wide margin, yes.
By a wide margin. So Mark, I'll start with you. How could the US Postal Service better use its post office network, first of all, to meet its core goals, and then to ensure its relevance going into 2024 and beyond?
So part of the Postal Reform Act of 2020 was a small part that allowed the Postal Service to offer services, non-postal services, to government agencies, and not just the federal government. They could do local governments, state governments, tribal governments, and it could be things like they already handle passports, they already do fingerprinting in some locations, but we haven't seen any really growth in that. And I think that if they could do that with these governments that are struggling to get good employees, these governments that are struggling with keeping their facilities open, you offer those types of services, prove that you can do it, and then potentially maybe the next round of postal reform to allow them to do even more.
I think there's an inherent challenge, though. The Postal Service has a lot of locations, but they weren't selected on the basis of being good places to shop. Often they were placed where it'd be a good place to have a delivery unit and you stuck a retail counter in front of it. So attracting people to those locations is not necessarily going to be easy. There's another concern I've always had about the notion that you could just drive more traffic through post offices and generate additional revenue. Arguably, anything the Postal Service offers in its post offices is going to be offered in a competitive market, right? Whether it's financial services or any of the other things that people are pining for. The Postal Service is not likely to earn very high margins on those kinds of products because they're available in a lot of locations already. And so it may drive some traffic, but anyone, I think, expecting major contributions to offset postal losses from new products, I think is barking up the wrong tree.
It doesn't have to be major to be successful. Is it going to be high margins? Not necessarily, but 10% of something is better than 0% of nothing. And the traffic is there. I go to my local post office. I wrote about it recently. I like going occasionally on Saturdays to watch people struggle with the mail and watch these saints called postal clerks of which my dad was one, handle these people who don't know about it. And you have people there. And I think that if there was one or two more things, again, it's incrementalism that can change things.
I have to call foul. I wasn't told there was going to be any math on this program, and Mark is throwing out percentages.
Oh well, look, you two live in the land of the imperial unit, so let's perhaps we should leave the maths out of it. How many pounds are there in a stone, or how many feet are there in a mile? Anyway, nobody knows, nobody cares, because it's a stupid way of measuring things. Anyway, but getting back to post offices ever so briefly, if I may just quickly interject on this. What you've both just described, though, are the two sides of the argument when it comes to doing other things in the post office. There is an argument that says the post office should be the front of house for government. And that's been done with varying levels of success in different parts of the world. But it is also in part dependent on the level of digitization in government. All right. So let's be realistic about this. If there's not a high level of digitization in government, maybe there is an opportunity. And if there is not a spread of front office services for government services, then maybe there's an opportunity there. When it comes to the commercial side of things, there is an argument, yes, that says, well, why would you jump into a market that's already very competitive or is already well serviced? You'd probably say, well, perhaps there's not such a commercial need from the Postal Service's perspective to jump into, what do they call it? What was that old cliche people used to go about? Red ocean and blue ocean and all that sort of nonsense. I don't know. I think we all get the gist of it here, that you have to carefully choose how you're going to broaden the post office's services. The other factor in play here is automation, of course. If you've got a location where no matter how many services you stuff into it, it's never going to turn a profit or never going to be a sustainable business, shall we say. I use the word business, but I think we can all glean what I'm trying to say here. If I'm talking about a small post office, even if you put passports in, how many people are there in the town? How often will they need to renew their passports? How often will they need to renew their driver's licenses? How often will they need to access government services and all those sorts of things? Do you instead need to look at a different way to offer postal services in that community so that the locals still have access to the US Postal Service? It might be, but there might be a different way to do it. What I've just said, though, is, again, opening the door to a huge conversation, just as big as the conversation about what do you do about letters. But there are forums where we can get together and talk about these things. And anybody listening from the US Postal Service who wants to grill me about this, get in contact with me. And I'll let you know what I think. I mean, when I say I'll let you know what I think, by the way, I mean it in a very polite way. I don't mean to be aggressive about this. Anyway, shall we move on? Let's move on to looking forward to 2024. What do you think PMG DeJoy's vision for 2024 will be? What are the kind of things that he would hope for the US Postal Service to achieve in 2024?
I think number one on the list is furtherance of the plans to upgrade and improve the logistical network that undergirds postal services in the United States. That's a top priority for the Delivering for America plan. It's just getting underway, and I think they need to show some significant progress in upgrading the network next year.
And because that improving the network means consolidation, that means displacement of employees, that means potentially hitting service standards. So if there isn't an improvement in both service and savings, I think you could see some rough waters ahead.
And it may be too late. I hate to say that, but if you look at the numbers, a $6 billion loss equates to roughly 50 to 60,000 employees that you would have to excess to make up that deficit. That is not going to happen overnight. It's hard to imagine that happening even during the course of the year. So the hole is pretty deep, and yeah, they really need to see some progress in the network, but it's already kind of late.
Now, to this point, we've managed to not mention pensions or anything like that, or healthcare debts, or whatever the dickens it is that we've talked about so many times when it comes to the Postal Service. And we're not going to talk about it today, but we are going to talk about Amazon. Amazon, well, there are a couple of articles in the media in the last few weeks talking about claiming that Amazon deliveries so parcels from Amazon, were being prioritized in the US Postal Service delivery network over letter mail. And now some of the articles were clearly written by people who didn't understand how post works. But what's really happening? I mean, is this the case that somehow parcels from a commercial client, commercial customer, are being prioritized over other letter items from other commercial clients? Mark, you've just said yes very quickly there. Well, tell me what you reckon.
Well, I mean, this has been going on for years, right? This is not finger pointing to the current administration. Amazon, was originally the Postal Service, at one point, the Postal Service's largest customer because of the number of packages, until just recently when they became the largest non-government package delivery in the United States. However, in rural communities where the Amazon has either decided they won't expand their network or can't find people. I don't know, what the case is with the town that was profiled very highly in national news. They are putting packages first. Most of these are rural route carriers, which means they aren't using postal vehicles. They're using personal vehicles or, the old retired postal vehicles. So, it is a space issue, and they are being told, this is what they are stating. However, there was just a news story yesterday. They are no longer allowed to say they are prioritizing Amazon's packages. They are prioritizing a delivery partner's packages.
I have to respectfully disagree with my friend Mark. And in full disclosure, Amazon is a member of PostCom. I'd say it's accurate to say that the Postal Service is prioritizing packages relative to letters and flat-shaped pieces of mail. But I don't think they discriminate between shippers when it comes to prioritizing those deliveries. And I think what happens is Amazon is, probably still the Postal Service's largest shipper. And if you're the Postal Service, you would say, well, of course we have to. They take up much more floor space or much more cubic volume. If we don't prioritize getting packages out the door, we will be creating bottlenecks that will affect all of the products. So that's correct. This has been going on for decades, not just the last couple of years. But I think it's a characteristic of the shape and not the originator of the package.
When I saw these articles, I have to say my first response was, why don't you just try and hire some extra staff to deal with the excess deliveries? I know it's a kind of stupid way of looking at it in some respects. You say, well, that's just introducing more cost. But if you've got the volume there, why aren't you doing it? And I reading between the lines as well, there was an issue with some of those delivery contractors out there who had those fixed rate contracts. We're getting into the weeds now, as some people like to say, as a phrase I hate, but I've got to find a better one than it. I can imagine if you've got a contract that says that you spend 1.5 hours setting up and then you spend 6 hours delivering, and all of a sudden you're spending more time setting up, you're spending more time delivering, and you've got no prospect of getting your individual contract reviewed, then you're going to be a little bit ticked off if you're spending 9 hours a day on a contract instead of 6 or 7 or whatever it should have been.
There's an underlying issue with the way rural carriers are compensated that is driving some of the media attention on this topic. But the problem for the Postal Service is, the demand for shipping is lumpy with a big seasonal peak right now. And so it sounds straightforward to just hire additional staff to take on the additional volume. But if that volume spikes for a month, you can't take on a full-time career employee that has a 40-year employment horizon.
Or do you change the way you handle it and look at doing a unit rate for parcels? Something that's, there are all these options out there. The problem is that they all cost money, don't they?
They do. And the Postal Service is in a competitive environment. They compete against some of the best companies in the world for shipping business. And they have real constraints on their ability to just drive pricing on packages.
Now, there are probably European people listening to this just screaming into their earphones or to their car stereo or wherever they're listening to this right now saying, well, what about out-of-home delivery? Can't they just deliver the excess parcels to parcel lockers or divert them to the post office for people to collect without a delivery attempt? Now, I know there was just an announcement the other day by the USPS that there are more ways to use the US Postal Service's parcel lockers. There aren't very many of them, are there?
Not yet. And so far, only at post offices. So if you're expecting a revolution where you can suddenly go to the closest 7-Eleven to get delivery, that's not happening anytime soon.
Well, co-locating them with post offices makes sense in many respects because that means that the local postal employees can load them, they can take out the uncollected parcels, and there's also a sense that you've got that one central postal location. Where's the local parcel locker? It's at the post office. That comes back to the other early question, though, which was not question, but the point I think Mike may have made about the location of post offices as well. And if you've got post offices that were historically located near a highway or near a railway line, and that's not where the local population is anymore, well, that's a separate planning issue for the post office, isn't it?
And a significant challenge. When you've got that big a retail footprint, reorienting it is no small task.
But lockers, they are lagging on lockers compared to the rest of the world, especially Europe. And, this current plan, while initially I was excited, most of these lockers, virtually all of them, are going to be inside the post office and only available when the post office is open. So they're not outside where if you get off of work at 5 o'clock, Ian, and come home, you can't go get your package.
I do find the Postal Service's retail strategy a little bit baffling. I live close to a automated self-service 24-hour post office that is very convenient, very well located, and it was instituted, I think, about 5 years ago. And it was the first of its kind, and I don't think there's been a second, even though I found it to be a really great experience and, again, very well located. And it seemed to offer great potential, and it's still there, but there's been no expansion.
Well, I feel like we've left the post office discussion half finished, but if we try to finish it, we'll be here for a very, very, very long time. Mike, if people want to find out more about what you do and what PostCom does, where should they go?
We're easy to find. PostCom, postcom.org. You can find everything about us.
And Mark, if people want to know more about the services that you and the team offer there at the Berkshire Company, where should they go?
It's just berkshirecompany.com, no spaces. Or, as you know, I'm always available on LinkedIn.
I'll stick those links, Mark's LinkedIn profile, and anything else I care to add on the episode page associated with this very discussion on thepostalhub.com. So go to thepostalhub.com, look for this episode, and you'll find Mike and Mark's contact details, or the way to contact them, on the page there. Mike Plunkett, President and CEO at PostCom, and Mark Fallon, CEO and President of the Berkshire Company. Thank you both very much for joining us on the Postal Hub podcast today.
Thank you, Ian.
Thanks, Ian.
Coming soon on the Postal Hub podcast, Kevin Seller from Escher, David Spottiswood from Hurricane, Jonathan Boaziz from Cardinal. We've got Kate Muth from IMAG talking about developments in international mail, and more great guests coming up very soon. Make sure you don't miss any of these episodes. Sign up for the Postal Hub podcast e-newsletter. You can go to thepostalhub.com. You can sign up for my newsletter there. You can subscribe to the podcast on podcast platform. I say this every episode. I'm sure you all know. I'm saying it anyway. Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, all the rest. Subscribe, leave a rating, please. Leave a review if you like. All helps. All positive reviews gratefully received. If you want to follow me on LinkedIn, do so. Look for me, Ian Kerr, on LinkedIn. You can click the follow button, and I promise not to fill your feed with any of that terrible AI-generated art that's floating about at the moment. Oh, it makes me sick. Anyway, what else can I tell you? If you want to email me, my email address is ian@thepostalhub.com. I'm Ian Kerr. Thanks for listening in, and I look forward to your company next time on the Postal Hub podcast.